All right, Kinesiology 230, still on chapter 1 here. This is presentation 7. We're cruising right along. Now we're going to talk about the nervous system. The nervous system itself is kind of like the hard wiring in the body. It provides the motor impulses that are sent to the muscles to perform contractions, but also the sensory impulses that are sent away from the muscles and the other organs to convey information about the body to the brain. This happens from the peripheral nervous system up through the central nervous system, and we'll talk a little bit more about both those here in a moment. So when you look at like the CNS, central nervous system, that is the brain, and then the spinal cord going down the back here that runs in the vertebrae. And then you have the peripheral nervous system, which is outside of the CNS. So like, for example, the CNS, you'll have the cervical area of the central nervous system. You'll have a number of different nerve roots that come out. They form a plexus up here in the shoulder, and then it branches off into other branches and regions within the body. The two main components you have are motor, which is efferent, and sensory, which is afferent. So just think of it, sensory is afferent, motor is efferent, and I think we'll have a pretty good example of how to remember that here in a moment. So you have two main functions within the actual nervous system itself. Somatic, which is responsible for activating skeletal muscle, and then you have autonomic. The autonomic side controls stuff like, your heart rate, blood flow, digestion. Within the autonomic side, think automatic. You have sympathetic nervous system, the SNS, or the parasympathetic nervous system. And with that, the way I would remember this is in the autonomic side. Like I work in a retirement facility, and I had one lady who it was very much always on alert, always kind of nervous, always kind of like full of anxiety. Her sympathetic nervous system was on all the time, and she was always in fight or flight mode. She was always like, you could see whether it was her anxiety or the amount of sweat that she had. She was always just kind of like stressed. So usually when you think of these, you have two different ways of thinking of them. One of which is the fight or flight or rest and digest. Sympathetic nervous system is fight or flight. That's that kind of anxiety driven. And the parasympathetic nervous system is rest and digest. And we'll talk a little bit later on in terms of some of the adaptations you have to training. But when you look at, heart rate variability, when you evaluate it, it tells you very much which one of these is in the driver's seat. When your heart rate is very much like a metronome, and it's very much 1 beat per second, that tells you you're kind of in fight or flight. You're kind of, the sympathetic nervous system is upregulated and kind of running the show. When you have a heartbeat that might be like, instead of 1 per second, it might be 0.9 milliseconds, 0.85 milliseconds, 1.1 millisecond. There's some variability in there. That's where heart rate variability terminology comes from. Now the parasympathetic system is actually running the show. So you can evaluate that on an EKG lead, or you can evaluate that through heart rate variability, like on many wearables that you see on a watch. And this passage to the right is another one I want you guys to go ahead and read through a couple times. The nervous system has somatic, voluntary, autonomic, involuntary functions. The somatic nervous system is responsible for activating skeletal muscles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I would take the time to read this and review it, and maybe even read and review it 20 times. So as we progress through the content, we're talking about this process of the sensory side and the motor side and how these two work with one another in the human body. And one of the greatest ways I always describe this is, that's the way I remembered it, to be quite honest, when I was an undergrad. When you look at the hot stove example, if a person places their hand on the hot stove, and when they place their hand on that hot burner, the afferent side, the sensory side, sends an impulse away from the skin in my hands, up through the peripheral nervous system, up to the central nervous system, stating, dang, that stove is hot. Well, the central nervous system then sends an efferent or motor response down to the muscles through the peripheral nervous system to move the hand away from the stove. So in this scenario, the way I always describe it is, you put your hand on the stove first, there's a signal that goes up that tells the peripheral and then the central nervous system that it's hot, and the signal comes back down to actually take your hand off the stove. The signal that goes up is the sensory side, it's the afferent side. The signal that comes down to contract and move the hand away is the efferent side. A comes before E in the alphabet, and so the sensory signal, the afferent side, that the stove is hot, was sent up first, and then the motor signal side that comes down comes second, A before E. Sensory neurons carry signals from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system, and motor neurons carry signals from the central nervous system down to the peripheral nervous system and then to the muscles. I hope that helps. Okay, so dendrites are kind of projections that form the neuron cell body. They receive signals from the CNS and transmit them to the muscle fibers, and they also collect and process proprioceptive feedback. Right? Proprioceptive is the terminology for like understanding where our body is in space. And that's our body's understanding of where our body is in space. And that's kind of quirky to say, but you have these proprioceptive mechanisms in the body that provide feedback up and down the peripheral and central nervous system to help your body know where it is at any given time. With the muscle spindle and the GTO, Golgi tendon organelles, oh my goodness, they are, I go back here, they are proprioceptive feedback mechanisms. They take proprioceptive information of where our body is in space and how our body is moving and sends it through the central nervous system to either shut down or to create a response, one or the other. Either way, it's still a motor response. So with muscle spindles, those are found in the muscle itself, and they sense like the rapid change of muscle length. You have like a quick stretch of the muscle. The GTO, they're located at the junction down here where the muscle attaches down to the bone, because tendons connect muscle to bone, and it measures or evaluates stretch. So you have a sensory afferent neuron in there. Remember, A comes before E. And then you have the same thing here, sensory neuron in the muscle spindle, same thing. That'd be afferent. A comes before E. And with that, the muscle spindle is enclosed and it lies kind of parallel with other muscle fibers. And the muscle spindle has these other interfusal fibers that have contractile proteins at each end, actin and myosin. And when it's stretched, it'll cause a sensory discharge, meaning afferent, towards the central nervous system, right? It goes, because it's sensory, it's going towards the CNS, and that's represented up here in the sensory neuron going towards the CNS. And then a motor response, the efferent side, is sent down to the muscle to contract. And this is often referred to as myotatic or stretch reflex. And there's a difference between what a muscle spindle does and how it responds to overstretch and what a tendon, GTO, does in terms of stretch. So let's take a look at this. Remember, the motor response for a muscle spindle is to make the muscle contract. Now, with the myotatic or stretch reflex, from a practical standpoint, stretching exercises are typically done in a way to activate muscle spindles. And I will say this, like when I teach running technique, part of the running technique component is we have to teach our athletes to become more and more dynamic so we can almost like win over the proprioceptive response that they'll have when you overstretch a muscle, overstretch a GTO. And you want to basically teach the body how to quiet those and dampen those and not go into contract and protect mode. So with the GTO, it's located down here at the junction between the muscle and the tendon, and the GTO gets deformed or stretched when the muscle is activated. So it contracts, the muscle contracts, and it pulls on the tendon. And if it's too rapid, the efferent response is to relax this muscle and then stimulate the antagonistic muscle group. So if this becomes too overloaded, too fast, the muscle that's causing that action to happen no longer receives the contractile stimulus. It doesn't receive a stimulus to shut off. It just stops, or it will have a reduction in the stimuli to actually contract that muscle. But what happens is the antagonistic muscle group, in this case, it looks like a bicep because you have, looks like the radius and the ulna down here. And this looks a lot like bicipital groove for the bicep tendon. So you end up having the bicep in this example would relax and the tricep will get a contractile response. Whereas over here, for the muscle spindle, if this becomes overstretched and you're laying side by side with the interfusal fibers, the motor response that would be sent would be for the muscle to contract. Got it? So the agonist in this case would contract for the muscle spindle. If we go to the GTO and this becomes overstretched, the agonist, the bicep here, will be sent less contractile signals, and the antagonistic muscle group, the backside, the tricep, will be sent a signal to contract to try to protect. Got it? That's the biggie you have to remember. The muscle spindle sends a signal for the agonist to contract. The GTO sends a signal for the agonist to relax, and the antagonist, the backside muscle, to contract. Woof, you got this. I know you do.